where to enter the discussion would be one thing that stimulated me was this idea of personal connection. You know, you talked about people getting back in touch with this sort of local environment. And I'm curious among the speakers how you came to this, and if there is a personal connection that you have that perhaps is common, and maybe that's a place to start teasing out the invisible within you. How did you get connected to this material?
I'll start since I'm on a roll here. That question is the holy grail of environmental education. I mean, it really is, and it's how one develops an ethic of care. If you look at what Carol Saunders is doing at the Brookfield Zoo and this new movement of conservation psychology, everyone's trying to figure out this question: how do you do it? I'm not sure we can ever know. For myself, it was my first trip to the Hayden Planetarium. I grew up in the New York City metropolitan area, and I got the Golden Guide to the Stars. And I came home and I was reading at a very young age, and I opened that book up and I thought, wow. I mean, I didn't say it like that when I was 5, but I didn't learn to say that until 1967. But I opened that book up. It was, wow, look at this. And then I got the Golden Guide to the Weather. And then I'd start going out and looking at the sky. And I don't know, whenever we take family trips, there was just an intangible, life-giving awareness to hiking on trails. But I can't explain it, you know, it's just something I always knew. And maybe that I'm giving up. Maybe that's, maybe social scientists can explain it. But I think it's idiosyncratic. I think we look for these patterns, but the fact of the matter is almost every individual takes a different path to that awareness. That's my view.
I recollect a tremendous fascination with dinosaurs when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and just reading everything I could get my hands on about dinosaurs, which is interesting because, you know, their fate, the extinction of the dinosaurs. And I think there's also this tendency, certainly people that become scientists are always asking questions. There's a tremendous curiosity that seems to be in a hyper-aroused state in those of us who, you know, become scientists, is forever asking questions. I can remember being in a catechism class and the minister finally looked at me and said, "Keel, you should be called Thomas, you know, because you ask so many questions." And so the connection on the geologic time scale was, I think, the first feeling that I had that I wanted to understand, you know, where did these beings come from and what happened to them? And then on a different context is I've always had a tremendous sense of connection to animals and an appreciation that animals are not some subspecies that are to be owned and treated in a certain way, but they're beings that we relate to. And I think it's those two things that put me on this path of understanding the environment and then feeling that there's a connection to it. And as I pointed out more recently, just this growing awareness that we're on a path that I agree with you. It is the latest fear. It's a fear that seems to be very difficult to communicate to most people. They have, you know, terrorism is much higher on the list of fears than global warming. And yet, if you ask me which is the most threatening to us as a species, by far it's global warming. It's not terrorism.
Yeah. So we asked the question if you had a personal connection to nature, and if there was some reason or maybe some instance in whether you connected into this topic. I was just curious if you had something that really sparked your interest in you.
Well, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, so in a suburban, I guess, environment. And so my connection with nature was far more, I think, in a sort of gardening, almost Edenic sense of relationship in which the human-built environment in parts of our city was very beautifully integrated into the natural environment. My dad was an artist, sort of a landscape painter. His focus was always on that nice mix, looking across, for example, the Mississippi River, which is very powerful natural presence, but with the bridge across it at the same time, it's sort of human interface. And so my dreams, I think, of a hopeful future for us as a species are ways that we can try. I think we're sort of at if we survive at all, we're at a very dangerous adolescent stage of human evolution in which our technological capacities have grown in economic, but that we need to think of our artificial environment in its most expansive sense, including the economy as well as the physical built environment, as a subset of the processes of the natural environment, integrate them in ways that, in other words, I think of sustainability as treating our artificial constructions in the built environment in a way that is harmoniously located within the systems of the natural environment. So in some sense, that was the sort of last message of that talk, in which we don't storm across the border and interrupt these equilibria. And so I think of that really, that vision is very much in concert with my earliest experience of the places that my father would take me in the older parts of the city in which there were these huge oak trees and small structures in courtyards and that sort of thing, so beautifully integrated into that sort of old-fashioned southern style. Okay. Yeah.
Let's make a suggestion that we go around and do that.
Awesome.
Robert actually might want to make
Yeah, if we could respond to something that we've heard this morning.
Yes.
Yeah, please do. I don't want to interrupt though, because I like the idea too of telling our stories.
Actually, we're going to do that this afternoon.
Okay. So I'd like to respond to what Mitch, is it Mitch or Mitchell? Mitch. First of all, it was nice to hear somebody from New York again. With all of that.
I don't cheat.
Yes. And I just wanted to start off by saying that I too had an awakening at the Hayden Planetarium, but it was where I got my first kiss under the stars. I learned about the relationship between Eros and Cosmos. Well, these are the kinds of things you never forget.
That was so well said.
I was 5 when I went to the Hayden Planetarium. I didn't have that experience.
I was a little older, I was 12. Wow. But I was taken by your remarks on education because I think that is so powerful. And I want to tell a brief story, but first I want to say that when you said that we have to be careful about over-psychologizing, I think that's true, but I think we also have to understand that we're living in a culture in which the natural world has become unconscious precisely because of our educational system and values. I think if we can begin to teach children in a hands-on way, as you suggest, and open them up to the environment, then I think the natural world is less unconscious, and we would need less of that work that we still do need today because it is unconscious. But the story about education is the following. When my oldest son was in the first grade, we had a brand new teacher who was enthusiastic and excited, and she had a lesson plan built into her work where she was teaching them about the planets, and the movement of the planets around the sun. And he came home with his first test in the first grade, and he had a 0 because it was about questions about the movement of the Earth. And I'll never forget, one question was simple stuff like, does the Earth move around the sun? And he wrote yes and no. And I mean, he grew up with me as a phenomenologist, and so for a phenomenologist, that's the right answer because it depends on where you are. And I said, let's go for a walk, Jeff. And I said, why did you say yes and no? And he said, well, when I'm walking with you on the street, the Earth is not moving. But if I get in a rocket ship and go up into space, that was a good answer. You know? And I never taught him anything about Husserlian phenomenology. Because kids are just basic phenomenologists. They live the world in and through their bodies. So I decided it was necessary for me to teach a science section to these first graders and to try and bring in the idea that science is a powerful point of view that does not completely take into account other perspectives of what the Earth and we are. It's a point of view, you can't challenge it, but you have to see it as a perspective, not the truth with the capital T. So I brought in a microscope. And I had prepared some slides in advance. I had a grain of pepper, I had the wing of a fly, and other things that I don't remember. I had about 5. And I wanted to teach the children that when you look under a microscope, you are entering into a particular perspective. And so I had the things there, like the grain of pepper, and I bent down, I looked, and I said, oops, I forgot. I got back up. I said, I got to close one eye, bye, and down. Why? Because kids learn by mimicking, imitation. And I said, wow. They were hooked because they wanted to see what I saw underneath them. And so they all came up and they all did the same thing. Oops, forgot, bye, wow. And then they sat down. And then I wanted to teach them one other lesson, that to see things in that way, you have to take them out of their living context. So I had a scissor, small little scissor, and there was this girl sitting in the front row with a mane of red hair. And I said, could I just have one strand of your red hair? I cut it off, and I said, I made much of her beautiful red hair. I put it under the thing. I did the same thing, bye, wow. And I didn't say anything about taking things out of context. I didn't quote Galileo or anything like that. They were getting the point. And here was the point of the lesson. At the end of it, I asked them to tell stories about what they saw. And the grain of pepper became boulders that they put on their hamburgers. And the flies, they made up stories about what they saw. There were facts there, but they needed to live in the story. And there was one more lesson to learn. I said, now can we put everything under the microscope to see it? Or are there some things that we cannot see if we do that? Can anybody name one thing? And they all said, no, everything can be put under the microscope. And here's where I got a little bit of a fright. Because one kid raised his hand and said, I could go home and cut up my brother and put him under the microscope. And for days I looked at the newspaper, thinking, what monster had I created? And I said, anything, one thing that you cannot see if you put it under a microscope. This I will never forget, and my son still knows the name of this little girl. From the back of the room, a hand went up like a snake, It's a girl with beautiful blonde hair and a lisp. 2 front teeth missing. She said, I don't think you can see under a microscope. And I said, what is that? And she said, a smile. You see, to me, that hooks into what you're saying. Because we do have to teach the powers of science and all of its technology and all of the vision that it gives us. But we also have to teach it as a point of view, which takes us sometimes too far away from the living reality of the day. So I think what you're trying to do in education is absolutely essential. Thank you for the talk.
Your very own Manhattan Project.
You mentioned something I think that was so interesting about, and I think we grew up in the same neighborhood. There was chemistry and physics and what was the third one? Biology. And then that was for the dummies that took earth science. And but we're starting, I think the big challenge here for those of you in the academic world and in the science world is to somehow or another realize that those that are teaching our young kids know so little about the natural world and so little about the environment. And this was brought home to us in our series Journey to Planet Earth. We sort of make it available to schools. Colleges use it, many 700 colleges. But when we start getting into the middle and upper grades, there's a tremendous reluctance to use environmental material. And it's not because the kids don't want to know it, but teachers don't understand it. Many of these teachers, and we've discovered, these concepts never existed when they were in teaching, when they were in school. So somewhere along the line, in order to get kids to be interested in the natural world, we better get our teachers interested in the natural world. And then the other problem, of course, is that this administration and many other administrations are forcing people to adhere to certain standards, testing, so there's no room for the natural world quite often. So I think that's a great challenge for you in the academic world and the science world. Those of us that are journalists, we just listen to what you have to say and try to translate it. But I know there's tremendous reluctance and resistance in the lower grades and the middle grades about dealing with environmental concepts because teachers just don't understand it.
I think your ideas about having people write as many words as they can with these prefixes, I'm going to do that the first day of class. I think it's great. And also the idea of what the kids can learn about numbers and the journeys. And it reminds me that Aldo Leopold was maybe the first one who talked about the journey of the atom through the rocks and so on. So Leopold's atomic or phosphorus atom journey could become part of your global ethic, the Earth ethic. Because I think that idea of time and space and the integration of time and space is totally critical. And one thing I wanted to say about your talk this morning, you, in the early part of your talk, you said that the oceans remember the heat, and the pot of water remembers the heat, as if that was an animate thing and could actually remember. And I was appalled because I thought, scientists animating, I mean, this is personal animism, man. We don't do this in science. But then I remembered that maybe this, in using this as a metaphor or a way of thinking about it, makes it connect to our bodies and how we collectively as a species remember or forget And David Abrams' book has a fantastic chapter on the remembering and forgetting of the air. And so I think this way we use language can connect our bodies and our present being and our present state to what happened in the past and what we've forgotten and what we could actually recall and then remember.
I think there's a tremendous reluctance within the scientific community to use metaphor to convey the ideas that need to be conveyed. There is a fear that if you go down that road, you're giving up your scientific credentials and that you can be criticized by your colleagues for not adhering to the rules of science. Well, I really believe that it's time to push those boundaries out. And after all, we can think of scientists who, in the past, were great spokespersons for science that used metaphor. I think one of the issues at hand is that we don't have anyone like that that's come to the fore recently in terms of the global climate change issue. If you think of Sagan's series on Cosmos, that I think probably if you interview planetary scientists who are in their 30s that could trace their interest back to watching, that series on public television about the cosmos. And there are shows like that we can all think of where people did a brilliant job of using metaphor, mythos to convey science to the broader public. I think that's something that's missing right now. It's there, but we just need more of it. And we need to be less afraid, as I say this to scientists, we need to be less afraid of our credentials and invoke these images more to reach out to people.
But yes, but excuse me, isn't the whole of science resting on a set of metaphors?
Absolutely.
And so, that tree is a set of mechanisms. The mechanical metaphor is at the base of the scientific revolution.
Yes.
And, the DNA, the DNA code, the computer of the brain, it's filled with metaphors. It's not that there's a reluctance to use metaphor. There's a reluctance to use metaphors drawn from the world that we did not make.
Yes.
And it's just assumed, as long as we're speaking of things according to the metaphors of things that humans invent, make, build, then we're being good, clean, objective. But if we take metaphors from the earth-born world,
But I think the problem is even more difficult than that. Yes, science does rest on a base of metaphors, but because it's so powerful in its effectiveness with the natural world, it begets its own metaphoric base, and then it becomes literal.
Exactly.
And that's the problem, is not the absence of metaphors, but the forgetfulness of metaphors.
Well, like Jeff himself saying, well, scientists don't use metaphors. It's like, come on, man.
But I think another problem is, I see scientists using metaphors all the time among themselves.
Yes.
I went to a meeting of virologists and it was all metaphor all the time, and I even went up to several and said, what are you doing? Gave some examples, and I said, why this way of telling, I don't use telling stories with science, why this way of communicating among each other? And he says, well, you can't see him. And I can still say it, you can't see him. But I think the additional difficulty is when that virologist is then asked to communicate with non-virologists, and particularly with general audiences, immediately gets panicky about metaphors because you've used them as somehow, now they're going to have some sort of dysfunctional effect on people who don't understand. Believe it or not, they'll be accused somehow of anthropomorphizing, accused of dumbing down, all these things that scientists worry about when they. So I think scientists communicate wonderfully metaphorically with each other. I just think they have difficulty. They abandon that process often when it comes to other audiences.
I think it's too hasty a generalization to say that science doesn't use metaphors that come from.
Louder?
It's too hasty to say that science doesn't use metaphors that come from the world that we don't make. I mean, the key metaphor for understanding of speciation is branching, right? And we talk about roots, and we talk about lots of other kinds of things like that. The problem seems to be when we use metaphors that attribute intentionality. And memory, the metaphor of memory in the ocean attributes intentionality. And the reason that's a problem is a very good reason. It's because we're all good Darwinians. And Darwin was adamant, that you never say better or worse or higher or lower, right? That there is no intentionality in the natural world. And that's the point at which I think we butt up against the problem, which comes from the roots of the sciences we understand it. Because we know if we do attribute the intentionality, then you get bad Darwinism. We know sort of where that movement went.
Well, this is the problem that Gaia ran into very early on, was intentionality, and it was challenged, and it's still challenged.
Doesn't that speak to the fact, though, that our notion and understanding of the animate is perhaps too restricted? And along with that, then, how we understand intentionality.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that it's absolutely true. I'm saying I think it actually falls quite a reason from the origins of the sciences we know them today, and from the origins of the secular humanism that a lot of us in this room espouse.
Small point, there is a recent book that's just come out in Britain, it'll be out in the States in September or something like that, by an associate of Jim Lovelock, who's gone off in his own direction, named Stefan Harding, brilliant educator, called Animate Earth, Science, Intuition, and Gaia. And it is very interesting carrying forward of these imaginational ways of feeling one's way into the living planet, and he takes you through the process of a hydrogen molecule, through the process of just feeling one's way into one's larger body of the planet. He does many exercises like this, very brilliantly done. It's called Animate Earth by Stefan Harding.
I'm struck by a thought that emerges to me in a sequence of comments from the ways of knowing and the use that Andrew made of intentionality. I'm thinking of a different mode of knowing that parallels, say, this a good Darwinian neutrality, and that the example of the case study would be, say, in the Northwest Coast, the interior Columbia Salish people, they have a tradition which continues in some muted forms, but continues to this day, where youth would be sent into a situation where they would hopefully encounter a song. The song, without going overly into detail, is it's an experience. So it's not a metaphor. It's an experience. So I'm trying to get at some kind of raw data that these people consider significant and something worth reflecting upon. And so the experience is when that child comes home, the family setting, they do not ask about it. I think they puzzle over intentionality. They're very interested in that. But the experience itself, if a metaphor or a sound, a word is put upon it, it's considered very problematic, because there's a different way of knowing. And I think that's what's interesting to me in terms of the Darwinian neutrality. What's the knowing here? And this mode of knowing among a particular people, that something has happened and they want to know about it, but there's an abiding. There's an intentional holding back to put any kind of metaphor and name on it, because the experience itself will out. The experience will out. I'm not sure if I've made any contribution, but just to end with this comment. Orrin Lyons, who I wish was here among us, a senior, an elder among the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people, he once said to me in response to a comment, "Don't you want to know what the women's ceremonies are? Don't you want to see? Don't you want to know?" And he said, "No, of course not. the women do their ceremonies, and I abide in a confidence that they are doing it, that the women are doing that. And there's something about the discussion I'm having too, that the sense of abiding in one another's confidence, abiding in those who have the interspatial understanding, whereas we abide in those who have the intergenerational, somehow to foster that type of a perspective also. It's a hopeful sign for me, hopefully.
This discussion is wonderful, and I'm so glad we're kind of right there. And I wanted to pick up on a couple points, but when Jeff said the reaction to the Gaia hypothesis, and Stephen Hardin, I know, would make a tremendous contribution along these lines. But a number of years ago, we brought Lamar Lewis to Bucknell where we were teaching, and to do her talk on Gaia, and the scientists went ballistic. Yeah. Absolutely ballistic. I've never seen anything like it, except when I did the presentation in Washington with AAAS and so on. But I think it's really interesting to examine why, and I think your point, Andrew, about the language in which we speak about the animate is absolutely critical to this. And I want to just offer, though, a sense of hope in that I think a convergence of some very interesting scientists who are just we had a conference just last week on Star Island off the coast of Maine with the Institute for Religion and the Age of Science, and it was on emergence theory. And Stuart Kaufman was there, and a number of key scientists in emergence and complexity theory, mostly science-oriented. And every one of those presentations, from the physical, chemical, geological, biological spheres, were speaking to, with great complexity in their presentations, of the inner organizing dynamics of these processes. And Terry Deacon, who wrote the book The Symbolic Animal and Symbolic Species, is pointing, very much in these directions of the need for empathy, for imagination, and so on. But the way he's describing these processes they're thermodynamic, they're morphodynamic, but they're teleodynamic at this further stage. And the question that came up is, how can one speak about self-organizing dynamics and emergent processes as having intentionality, you see, in this way that you're speaking of, Andrew, and that the telos is not, the final cause is not out there, either philosophically or out there theologically in a God in the sky and so on. And Gordon Kaufman from Harvard Divinity School did his presentation on creativity in the process as a whole, and people went wild. In other words, because they were putting together this sense of process thought and so on that's been developing creativity for a long, long time, and coming together with this sense of the creativity of these processes of evolution. And I think that this is an extremely important convergence from science and religion sets, but I think we don't have the language that's still going to make people feel comfortable with these processes. But
how did all the scientists assemble there? They all bought what was being said about.
Oh, very much so. Their presentations were bringing in their own research in illustrating how the self-organizing processes are working.
I wanted to ask Mitch about sustainability. I always am curious about that word. Who's sustained? Who's sustaining? What sustainability are we striving for?
Well, the word becomes so popular that it easily becomes meaningless. But what I'm finding is, and I'm out there now as a college president, I'm out there with a whole range of different types of people. Conservative Republicans who are concerned about the future of the environment, as well as progressive folks. And this is the use of this word is very helpful because they look at it as a way of conserving the future. They link sustainability to frugality. and to a kind of security. And I'm finding that, I'm not really answering your question, but I'm finding that the word which I eschewed for a long period of time has a lot of currency because it brings people who are otherwise really alienated by the environmental discourse into the fold in a way. So, because everyone's concerned about the place where they live in one measure or another, and everyone's concerned about energy now. And so the notion of sustaining means, it implies legacy. It implies how we think about our future. And it's kind of a reframing for folks who, again, who've been who've been very critical of the environmental point of view. So that's why I'm finding it very politically helpful at this point. Although, you know, it can mean many different things to many people.
Yeah, I guess that's where,
right?
If I were an executive for a fossil fuel industry, I would want to sustain my product.
But if you look at, the Scientific American just came out with a special issue on, on carbon and the end of oil. I was just reading it on the plane, and it's filled with Chevron ads about, they don't use the word sustainability, but that they're thinking about the future of the planet, and they care more than about now, whether I don't believe it, of course, but, I mean, look at British Petroleum. I mean, with the recent problems they've encountered, they've really done a lot to paint themselves as green, for better or for worse. So I'm simply saying that it's a strategic and tactical approach to use that now, although there are all kinds of political dimensions to the word.
There's a nice editorial in that particular campaign of renaming British Petroleum in today's New York Times on the editorial page. Yeah, interesting.
You talk about metaphor. In the late 80s, early 90s, Marilyn and I knew nothing really about the environment. We were storytellers and doing feature films and drama, a bunch of other things. But we somehow wanted to get involved in the environment and do something about it. So somebody told us we ought to go see Roger Revelle. So we went to Scripps, and we spoke with him, and he's quite a brilliant. So he said, well, there's a guy here you really ought to talk to. This guy named Keeling. Go see Keeling. Okay, we'll go see Keeling. Who the hell's Keeling? And he's a very sweet man. We heard that he'd been working on something for 30 years, the same thing. So he said, well, let me show you this Keeling curve. Show this Keeling curve. And I think it was even Marilyn. I said, why is it going up and down? I know it's going this way, but what's the dips? He said, well, that's the earth breathing. And all of a sudden, idiots that we were, something? There may be something here. And I've never forgotten that.
But is that an intentionality? Does that, see, for me, that's a perfect metaphor for what the biosphere is doing.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be intentionality, it's just an aliveness, a characteristic of being alive.
Technically, it's autonomic, passive. There's much intention in the earth breathing than if there's in me, which is none at all. Can I ask Mitch the question?
Oh, wait, just on this before we shift, or is this on the same?
No, it's not.
Well, it's just at the same time that environmental science and the natural sciences have been progressing, there's also been these shifts and progress happening within cognitive science and physiology and medicine. But so accompanying all of this has been this growing sense, especially stemming from the work of Francisco Varela, Umberto Maturana, that cognition, intentionality, is it just comes with being a body. That it's part and parcel of being an organism is cognition. So the language by which 20 or 30 years ago one would speak about the body and metabolism, but then you would
use a different language to speak of knowing or thinking or intent, but it seems like it's perhaps becoming possible now more and more to simply speak of metabolism or to speak of fully using just entirely bodily metaphors with the recognition that that already carries a kind of tacit cognition, or is already there in any living organism, simply by virtue of breathing or of orienting in space. That these are that there are little choices being made by the organism all the time. And it's not that it happens as a sheer determinate mechanical. Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the one of the examples you used to talk about the intertextual it was interspatial and intertemporal dimensions. Was you gave an example? If someone thinks the Earth was created 5,000 years ago, then how can they possibly get global warming, right? And then, yeah, and then you told me last night that I guess you were at a meeting here on global warming, and there were some of these fundamentalist ministers who famously now written to Bush and said, look, we think this global warming problem is really important, and we want you to, do something about it or take it more seriously, whatever it was, the letter, I can't remember exactly what it says. So, I don't know if those people have this sort of the, 5,000 year view or not, but we can imagine that there might be someone like that. So, if you're talking to that person, do you set them straight? Right? I mean, so you've got and I don't. I mean,
It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, because you want to kind of go. All the time. There might be something in that worldview, flawed as I think it is, right?
Right.
That still gives them the foundation for thinking that they have an ethic of stewardship that Bush is ignoring on the way down the line. So kind of, I don't want to mess with that.
I really do. As an educator, I think about that, and as someone who's very interested in strategically and tactically moving this material forward, I think about that all the time. That was the Yale School of Forestry ran a conference at the Aspen Institute that Mary Evelyn and John were also at, and in which some of these, there were several evangelical and Southern Baptist folks who were very skeptical about evolution and creationists, really. I have had several encounters with folks like that, and to answer your question, I just try to ask them a lot of questions about who they are and what their worldview is and try to understand it as best I can, because I know I'm not going to be able to accept them straight. I know that's not possible. I try to find common ground. That's just the way I am. And if I'm sitting in an airplane, I like to talk to my neighbors, and I always ask them what they do, so they'll ask me what I do, because I want to see what their response is to what it is that I do. And almost everyone will say, when they hear I'm an environmental studies professor now, president of environmental college, oh, I saw a deer in my backyard yesterday. And they'll always say something, they'll always have some impulse that they want to relate to me in some way that they think will please me, because they have approval needs. And just like I do. And I feel that's how I have to operate. So to answer your question, no, I'm not going to try to convince that person. I'm trying to find enough common ground that I can understand and maybe learn from that person. And there's one difference, though. Very often, when I meet with people like that, I know that deep down inside they think I'm damned. They think I'm fucked, and I don't think that about them. Now, whether that's a different order, where that goes, I'm fascinated by the evangelical Christians getting behind Israel now. As a Jew, this really fascinates me, because that's been a real touchy one over the centuries. I wouldn't trust that one very far. So there might be some common ground right now, but history tells me that's going to go wrong. But that's the documentary evidence that we have. So I know that's not exactly where you were going. So all I will say is, as an educator, I always try to ask as many questions as I can of the other person so I can understand their point of view as best as I can and find the common ground. But at the same time, I'm wary.
I wanted to pose a question, get back to what Jeffrey said about the ocean as a long memory. First, again, I don't know what it is, Mitch, about being in New York, but I have to say this too. When I get on a plane, I don't like to talk to people. And if somebody asks me what I do, I make it up on the spot. Yeah, so I've been a nuclear engineer, an undercover narcotics cop, an environmental,
I've been had. I've been had.
And I'm waiting for the day when I pick a discipline and the person is an expert in it.
I've also been told that I agree that if you fly to a place like Australia, Europe, you never talk to your neighbor.
Well, in any case, I found it.
Because they might not stop talking to you.
That's why I say, something like that, because in the hopes that they'll stop talking. When you said that the ocean has a long memory, I mean, we've been talking about whether it's an intentional metaphor or other aspects of it, and I think all of that is important, but it's the power of the metaphor in the way it touches us. Because when I heard that phrase, I also then wrote down, the ocean is the Earth's way of remembering us.
Yes.
And then I began to wonder, well, that's not quite the whole story. The ocean is also the Earth's way in which we are being remembered. And if you hyphenate that word, you get the sense of it being remembered. And when you take that long view and you see that because of the ability of science, that we have damaged the ocean so that it is heating up to what it was, 50 million years ago, did you say? Something like that. The effect that your metaphor has on me is to make me mourn, to make me feel a certain grief in relation to that powerful metaphor of what we have done to despoil this planet. So the power of metaphor for me is that it opens up the feeling function.
Yes, absolutely.
It's part of your this categories.
Yes.
The ocean was dismembered, and now maybe we can remember it
Exactly.
by putting it back together.
Yeah.
And the way I've seen it in the past is that science tends to look at the microcosm, and the metaphor tends to open up our intuitive knowing.
Yes.
But somehow we have a root that goes deeper. And science catches a snapshot of that and inspires something we already know. And I think we're trying to recapture that.
I was going to say that sometimes an embodied metaphor can provide the same basic conceptual understanding while providing that connection to the heart. So, as an example, we have the thermohaline circulation system.
The what?
Thermohaline circulation systems, the way that heat is transferred around the planet, ocean currents. It's often been called the world's conveyor belt. Now, there's a very mechanistic metaphor, right? Conveyor belt, that doesn't do much for me. But it's important in some way, except I only see conveyor belts at the airport, and I don't have to use one. So that's not, it doesn't carry much. But if you use the same describe the same system as the Earth's circulation system, and that the North Atlantic is actually a pump. It's like this pump right here. It's my heart. And it's the way that heat is moved on the entire planet. And it's because of that pump right there. And that's the potential pump that we could stop. I think that opens up a whole level of embodied awareness and experience that everyday people can immediately get to. It's potentially causing you to have a heart attack. Okay. Now, I know that's dangerous from a scientific standpoint, but I think it's far more effective than talking about it as a conveyor belt.
So you say, I was thinking of when we talk about being anthropomorphic, in a way it's a big mistake not to be anthropomorphic because we're all human beings and this is how we see the world. So if we can't in some way relate what's happening in the world to what we've experienced, especially in childhood, by being embodied and central and being able to move in that environment, then we're not going to connect. It's going to be some abstract, kind of intellectual, objective thought. And I think a certain amount of anthropomorphism is absolutely necessary. And when we think of the human body and our life and all the processes, I mean, we're simply the conscious part of nature. And we tell the best way we have of being alive and conveying our life experiences is by stories. So we have to tell stories about these processes
I think, to really be able to communicate scientific facts. Of course, one set of stories that's become fairly well known is that articulated by Teilhard de Chardin and by Thomas Berry more recently. Thomas Berry uses the phrase the news story, a sense of the human embedded in cosmic process. So while his focus on the human, perhaps their focus on the human is not just anthropocentric, but anthropocosmic, they place the human, or they attempt to see the human placement within this larger universe story.
It's not even, I wanted to be worth saying it. I mean, when you talk about feelings, you get these metaphors, tap into feelings. Is that synonymous with tapping into their values? Or is there a distinction? Just because values, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of reaching somebody's intrinsic values, even though values themselves are not stationary. In other words, I've just recently read something where the argument was made that values depend on the circumstance, one's value sets, that they change over time. And so we're not necessarily targeting a set of general genetically hardwired values, but rather a moving target over time. But anyway, if metaphors hit the target, I guess that's the question. Are we using them tapping into values?
I'd just like to frame the question in terms of the perspective of nature. Language wouldn't be language. We speak of language as something we're doing, and or that science needs to add metaphors. When language is the only way that nature shows itself to us. So it's not like previous cultures that have had a non-scientific language haven't seen nature. So we seem to assume that we can't see nature correctly through metaphors, but that's the only way nature ever shows itself. Just a story. My daughter went to Waldorf school, which is a school there that teaches more from a imaginative perspective. So the kids early on read a lot of fairy tales and this, and a lot of it's very animated about the nature and the stars and connected through this fairy tales. She had the opportunity to do that for about kindergarten and first grade, and she really got into it. When she was a child, she'd seen things. She talked quite animatedly about the world, and she was seeing the stars, and she got into astrology at that age. But we had to move. We went to a public school, and she was a kind of gifted kid, so she got into an astronomy class in second grade. It was a science class, her first science class, and she came home one day to me and after an astronomy class, and she looked at me and she said, she was just terrified, and she I didn't know what's going on. And she looked at me and she said, "You've lied to me." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "I just learned about the sky today, and there's just a lot of balls out there, and it's empty. And you've lied to me." And I think that was her first anxiety attack. But somehow, what I was aware of at that moment was that science isn't aware of itself as its intrusive language. It's not but somehow it's also cutting languages away. Because it was difficult for me at that point to say, well, you are now an existential being who is alienated in the world, and you will develop nature deficit disorder like everyone else. But those connections, that old language, those old metaphors, they actually also help us see nature. That's the way nature may need those.
Let me make a suggestion about the way this might work best, and that is that there is a language of science, and very often it's so abstract that it's completely mathematical. And teleology in its classic forms is not part of that language. I don't think that the only other alternative is mechanism. There's the emergence, complexity, chaos, and so on, which is a sort of intermediate zone between Aristotelian or Judeo-Christian teleology and 17th century mechanism. But what we need to do is to find metaphors which map well onto the scientific discourse. I just heard one on NPR the other day, in which an AIDS researcher was talking about the way the virus figures out how to respond to new drug treatments that they last for a certain amount of time. Then the virus figures it out, and we have to, invent a new medicine. Well, the virus isn't figuring it out in a way that a mouse is figuring out a maze, but it is nevertheless a useful metaphor to suggest its adaptability in a certain circumstance. The circulatory system is a beautiful metaphor which maps well on the actual process of convection in the oceans, whereas the conveyor belt doesn't map very well on because there's nothing, there's no mechanism sort of driving it. It's more like a self-organizing kind of process, similar to an organic thing. So that it's not so much a question of the language of science or language of metaphor, it's that the scientific description on the one hand just is often so abstract and cast in a vocabulary to which we do not respond in terms of values and feelings and so on. But we can find useful ways of achieving a kind of correspondence with that language in the language of metaphor, such as memory, or viruses figuring it out, or circulatory systems, and that sort of thing. But we know that it's not one or the other, that these are two different ways of communicating the same phenomena, one in a meaningful way, the other in a rigorous way.
We have probably time for one more, so this Norm. You used the word useful or utility, and I think of Tony and asking about the values question, and I thought about the reading that you were asked to do. And where I am now is I agree with everything that everybody has said about their childhood experiences and how much nature means to them, and how sometimes science can be so difficult to understand if you're not a scientist, and maybe difficult the other way around, scientists dealing with metaphor and anthropomorphizing. And I guess I'm on the utility thing now, because every day I'm trying to change behavior and thinking to bring about political change result in terms of addressing this big issue of climate change. So I guess my hope is that through this discussion will emerge things that I can take back that will connect up the value stuff with the science stuff that's really tangible, that has utility. And I guess I'm kind of in a middle path where I understand a lot of science, I understand a fair amount of psychology, and I'm learning a lot about some of the concepts on the spiritual side a little bit. And I guess I'm sort of everyman trying to bring these things together and then move forward politically. And I think that's going to happen for all of us in their own fields to get to integrate better. I don't know why I said all that, but
yeah, one quick one. What struck me in our discussion this morning is that so much of it focused on how do we convey what we know, and what I've heard is the underlying assumption that if we did that really well, sort of as if there was a perfect way to convey it, and we could evoke in everyone the right kinds of stories, values, whatever, then good behavior, whatever that means, follows. That somehow this knowing and having the right values, good values mean good behavior. And I mean, there's just tons of research that shows that isn't true.
It's the great conceit.
And so I'm just want to throw out sort of the suggestion that we don't get stuck just thinking about how to communicate this right, whatever that is. Because there's then this whole other side of how does that translate to doing anything differently.
think that's where the invisible.
Oh, I see. The magic? I think there's a little more than that too.
So one other thing I guess I'll say is that metaphor is like a spotlight. It allows you to see certain things, and yet it includes other things. And so, and it can cut in ways that we don't expect. And you did this wonderful thing in Lovelock, in which she talks about the metaphor of Mother Earth, and how we always use that. We put it on t-shirts, we put it on bumper stickers, love your mother, and thinking that that just automatically leads to good behavior. Well, in a patriarchal society where people don't necessarily love their mothers, is that such a great metaphor? It can cut off nice things that you don't expect. So I guess what I'll say is maybe we need is first of all to recognize that the Western ideal of finding the right metaphor is a fool's errand. And there is no single best. Perhaps what we need is metaphorical pluralism. We need a diversity of metaphors. We need as many new ways of thinking about these problems as we can, because each of them allow us to see different parts of the problem, but always being humble enough to recognize that there are always costs with our preferred metaphor.
Metaphorical pluralism.
That's right.
I think the thing that impressed me the most about Al Gore's movie, where he conveyed, I think, the whole emotional impact of the things that you scientists and global warming and so on have studied for years, was that cartoon of the Coca-Cola bears, a Coca-Cola polar bear, swimming toward an iceberg. And as they're telling the story about the Coca-Cola, the polar bear possibly going extinct, and but they can't get on the birds and catch their seals and so on. And they have to swim for 60 miles. I mean, you can tell the story about swimming for 60 miles and you drown. But it really hit me at least to see this, you know what I mean by the Coca-Cola bear? A couple of years ago, they had a commercial. These bears are drinking Coke, very, kind of nice fuzzy bears and so on. Although real polar bears are not that nice at all. But but here they have that kind of bear swimming toward a medium-sized iceberg, and he gets on it, and it breaks in half. And the focus is we just see the blue sea, and the iceberg, and then the bear swims to another smaller iceberg, gets on it and breaks, and then the bear starts to swim off, and the cartoon pans to the horizon. We now see the sky, and it's a completely empty ocean. And so you know what's going to happen to that polar bear. And that really hits you. And there's something about, to me, that was an excellent example of communicating at an emotional level, just what you scientists have been predicting with your computer models, Cray research computer models 30 years ago.
And I could say when I saw the film, there was this vocal expression in the audience in that scene. That was the one scene throughout the whole film that I could see constellated something within the audience. And that's the image. That's the power of image.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So whether that's a universal image or not, I would agree with you. We need many images to reach out to as many people as possible. Whether that means that the people who leave that theater are going to think about how their living their lifestyle affects the art is another question. How that translates into action, I think, is the key question. And hopefully that's something we will continue to explore here this week. But I think that is an extremely important issue. I guess we can have the greatest values system within ourselves, but how is it going to manifest? The utilitarian aspect of this is how do you take that and actually affect change?
But they didn't use that polar bear in the advertising of the film. They used penguins, because penguins are the favorite one. So it may have touched you, but somehow penguins still rule.
The first ad for Gore's film was smokestacks. And within 2 or 3 days, it was pulled to penguins for obvious reasons.
With that, I'd like to thank the speakers from this morning. And